knows everything, but everyone knows something no one else knows, including you. Welcome to the other side of things. I'm your host, Dr. Michael DeMaria, and for 35 years, I've been a guide of the soul. On the other side of things, we explore alternative perspectives on challenging topics, ranging from love, sex, death, and madness to dream work, breath work, and other cutting-edge healing modalities. We live on a precipice as a species, so let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Things. It's great to have you here, and I'm so thrilled to have this guest with us. An extraordinary human being, a incredibly prolific author, and his work I've been steeped in for the last 3 to 4 months. And I'm so thrilled he has taken the time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in, introduce him, and see where this takes us. Dick Russell is the author of 16 nonfiction books, including an amazing 3-volume biography of depth psychologist James Hillman, which I've just finished over the last 3 months. And each of these are, I don't know how many pages they are, Dick, but these are extraordinary works, and we'll get into that a bit. And the reason I really have him on the podcast today, My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism, a life-changing book for me, and a book I think I've been waiting to read for decades. 4 books co-authored with Jesse Ventura were New York Times bestsellers, and his Eye of the Whale in 2001 was named among the best books of the year by 3 major newspapers. He was also a recipient of the Chevron Conservation Award for his environmental work. This is a very brief introduction to an extraordinary body of work and man, and it's just such an honor to have you here, Dick. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, wow, Michael. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and I'm really happy to be talking with you today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Um, so, in My Mysterious Son, you explore this extraordinary journey of your son, Hamilton. I feel like I got to know you and Hamilton and his mother, Etta, so well. And you look at his schizophrenia through the lens that integrates mysticism, indigenous wisdom in particular. And there were lots of things that led up to you connecting with Malidoma, Patrice, who I also had the opportunity to work with. So that really stuck out to me. And for those listeners out there, I've mentioned this on other podcasts, my grandmother was diagnosed schizophrenic in her mid to late 70s, it was 1946. So at that period of time, was committed to a state hospital where she spent pretty much the rest of her life. One of the reasons I became a psychologist was trying to figure out what happened, and also to be the kind of person I wish she had had at the time, and in addition, I've had what I've called on other podcasts my soulchosis at 18. I've had friends and family who've also juggled with these extreme states of consciousness. And I thought, maybe you could give the listeners who are not familiar with the book, just a brief summary of what it's about. And also, this is the 10 years since the first publication. I know you in 2014, the original came out. 2017, you did a revised version, which I just got a chance to finish. But to just tell our listeners, maybe a thumbnail of why you wrote the book, what it's about. And I think also, I know for me, it's like, how is Hamilton now, and where are things, before we kind of jump into the details?
It's actually Franklin.
Franklin. Oh my goodness. I hear that. I think it's that the play. I can't believe I've been saying Hamilton. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I was thinking of the play too when you were talking about it.
Oh, good. Well, and you named him after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right?
That's right.
And
Yes.
so somehow I had the president in my brain. So 1,000 apologies. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
that's fine.
Thank you for
Uh,
correcting me.
um, well, we can start on that rather amusing note. So I wrote the book finally because, well, it's this, it's quite a journey that I went on personally, and schizophrenia, so called, comes out of the blue. I mean, when Franklin, who's biracial, was 17, bam, all of a sudden he said, I can't find my old self anymore. And it was the beginning of a very, very tough, long, a number of years of really trying to figure out how to help him, going through these times of when, he wouldn't even recognize me as his father, and been in the hospital in and out. And so, excuse me, but I wrote the book really because what eventually happened was that I discovered, and along with Franklin's mother, Etta, who's my ex-wife, and that discovered that I was deeply looking for something, some adjunct at least to medication that the pharmaceutical companies prescribe. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure. But um, so I was led down this path to a West African shaman named Malidoma Somé. And we'll also get into that a little more. But basically, I wanted to get across to people who may have similar experiences in their lives. And there's literally thousands of people who go through these kinds of, difficulties with their children, that there are other ways to look at this as what it is, and also not to be perhaps as hopeless about it as we often are as parents. That there's first of all, there's an incredible, beautiful otherworldliness that I learned about really from my son, and he educated me about this, and I wanted that to be known to people too, that there's a lot for us to see in our children, even if they're so-called afflicted with these things that we wouldn't wish upon them for sure. So that's in a nutshell why I wrote the book. Was not it wasn't out of some personal tell-all kind of thing. I just felt like maybe my story, and the story of Franklin and his mom, and what we went through together, and sort of coming out the other side of things in a sense, um, would be helpful to other people.
Beautiful. And I so was so touched, in particular as a father as well, who has struggled with a child who has gone through some similar things. And when you describe that first, uh, I think even the one reading he gave you when he wrote this experience that he had, and how that impacted you, and what it feels like to you described it so beautifully and powerfully, like the child you knew is gone
Yeah,
suddenly, like
yeah,
out of the blue, and how ungrounding and overwhelming that is. And so as someone who has struggled with those extreme states, and what's interesting to me too, when you read what Franklin wrote, and I saw another podcast where and the podcast person, gosh, what was that like? But literally, I remember at 18 writing those kinds of things, and my journal if looking back on it as a psychologist, I'd say this young man is in the midst of a psychotic episode, which
yeah.
I call soulchosis. And three things happened for me, and this is kind of a way, a roundabout, to connect to Hillman and how that brought you to Malidoma. um, Reading Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections at 18, where he's talking about his own, what I've come to call soulchosis, or extreme state. And also, because what happened to my grandmother, I didn't go to a hospital. I didn't even tell anybody, but I had a roommate who to this day is my best friend, who I say kind of loved me through it. And I also had a transpersonal psychologist who was able to kind of give me some frames of reference. So the Jungian template of that was an archetypal realm that any of us could, and I was like, oh, well, here's a guy people look up to, and if it happened to him, and maybe I'm not crazy, maybe there is some kind of gift in here. And of course there was years of other unfolding, but I found it really powerful that one of the shifts for you was your friendship with Hillman, and when he kind of gave you the permission to go with Franklin.
Yes.
because we're taught so often, both as from the psychiatric or mental health profession, don't enter into the psychosis, don't encourage it. Even as a psychologist, you're taught not to do that. Can you say more about that? How your work with Hillman, getting to know him and his, because I remember in the book, it's a beautiful moment where he says, Dick, you're worried about your son. What's happening. Tell me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at that point, uh, I don't think I was yet writing the biography of him. No, but we were riding along in the car one day, and let me just say briefly to preface that my extended family and I had been reading James Hillman back in the 90s, and I had loved Jung when I was younger, and read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I've been very moved by that. It changed me when I was, in
Mm,
my 20s. So, um, by mysterious circumstances I probably don't have time to get into, but I ended up meeting Hillman, and we had lunch together. And I'd sent him one of my books, Black Genius and the American Experience, and then we got together and we formed a friendship. We found that we had things in common. We didn't talk about psychology that much. We
mm,
talked about the fact we both loved boxing, and I'd known Muhammad Ali,
mm,
and the fact that we'd both been to Africa and loved Africa. So we developed this friendship, and he became very interested in the fact that I've lived in I guess you'd call it a communal or extended family situation for a long time. And so he came to visit and was fascinated by how we live. And so it was it was a friendship really. And then in 2004, toward the end of that year, his older sister was visiting him in Connecticut, where he lived with his wife Margot, and I was up there and listening to her stories. And I said, God, you should really get her, get her together. Just you got to tape some of this. This is
mm,
amazing. While she's still with us, and so that gave him the idea to bring together all of his siblings and his four kids for a weekend to just kind of go over the family history and film it. And so I had a young filmmaker friend and brought her along, and we spent that fascinating weekend. And as the reporter in the room, I asked a lot of questions. And out of that, our wives actually sat down and said, "Was James
mm,
ever going to do a biography?" And he never wanted to do that, but he certainly didn't want a psychologist to do it, because he knew that would, just get into all kinds of judgmental things and whatever. He just, wasn't interested.
sure.
So, he said, "Well, if I'm ever going to do it, I guess I'd like Dick to do it." So I was greatly privileged to
Mm,
have that be bequeathed to me. And my wife and I went to Ireland with he and his wife, and I went to Switzerland with him and spent years working on this. Thought it would just be one big book, and then it turned into eventually three, three large volumes, because I think he's the greatest thinker probably one of the greatest thinkers we've ever had, and certainly right up there with Freud and Jung in the 20th century. So that's a quick story about our relationship. But then he was never my therapist. I mean, he was a therapist and did that for 20 years. But so we're driving along one day, and he just sensed it. He had this way of picking up on things. And he said, "Something troubling you." He said, "Is it your son?" And I said,
mm,
"Yeah." So it is. And I explained to him that, that the so-called delusions that Franklin had, and where he would be just saying outrageous things, or so I built that building over there, or making up languages or whatever. It made me, especially in public, I would kind of cringe, and I would either correct him or just try to apologize to the person it happened to. And of course, that didn't make things any better between us, but I didn't know what else to do. And so James said, he said, "Why don't you just try going with it?"
mm,
He said, enter the delusion with him if you
mm,
feel like it.
mm.
Tell him, he said nobody treats him as a regular person.
Right.
It's all,
Right.
and so he's been to see all these therapists, psychologists, and who have these various ways of talking to him. But if you just talk to him normally, tell him what you've been doing in a day, see where it goes. Something comes up, that's off the wall, just see where that goes. Enter
Yeah.
it with him. And I tell you, once I started doing that, Michael, my relationship
Mm,
with Franklin completely changed.
mm.
Because I was no longer, the father who was upset with him about everything he did and whatever he thought. And we started to have fun with some of these things. I tell the story in the book of being in this Asian restaurant where we used to go to in Boston, and he'd started talking to the waiter in this invented Chinese, and the waiter didn't know quite what to do. And then the waiter went by at one point, and Franklin looked at me, and then he pointed at me, and he says, "Oh well," he says, "We're don't worry. He and I are speaking in you and I are talking in Cantonese, but he only understands Mandarin." So
I love that moment. I love
it
that
was it
moment.
was an amazing. It was just hysterically funny, and I started to laugh. And Franklin gives him this big shit-eating grin, and so our relationship began to change,
Mm,
and it was not too long after that that I started looking for alternatives to medication, not to take him completely off medication, although that would be nice,
mhm.
realizing it does have its benefits. But, over the course of the years, I mean, there was a period of time he was on Zyprexa, for example, which Eli Lilly made and never told anybody taking it that this was going to put a lot of weight on you.
Yeah,
And my son, put on like 100 pounds. I mean, it
yeah,
was terrible what had happened
yeah,
to him. And so I actually joined a class action suit with a
yeah.
bunch of other people and got a settlement for Franklin from that out of the company. But these were the kinds of things that, the medications at the beginning of his onset of his illness, if it's an illness, we can talk about that. But
Yes.
he, that's all they wanted to do was put him on. He was on three different medications, and of course they're deadening. He'd go off them because of how they made him feel, because he couldn't, communicate with these other worlds that otherwise, he was meeting beings.
Right.
And maybe I didn't understand that, which I didn't, but this was a very real to him. And so anyway, I then had heard about a man named Malidoma Somé from James Hillman, because they had worked together in what was called the mythopoetic men's movement, which I can go on about this for a second if you'd like. I
Sure,
mean,
sure.
it was, misconstrued by the media as, oh, a bunch of guys getting together in the redwood forest or the woods of Minnesota and, just drumming and getting, telling stories about their wives. And it was so far from that. It was a beautiful movement, which I think you know about too, Michael.
Yes, and we just had Michael Mead on last month, so yes, incredibly influential. And I had a chance to work with Robert Bly in a gathering as well.
Uh,
So very, and I want to hear a few more of your observations. But in the book, this I think it's volume 2 of the Hillman biography. You get in a beautiful expression where James says, this, yes, not only did they get it wrong, but this was about men finding a way towards a deeper soulful connection to their own hearts and the heartbreak of America, the
Absolutely.
heartbreak of what we have in a capitalist system where the only sense of meaning is making money versus something of the soul and creating culture and creating community.
Yes, and they used ritual, they used, um, mask making, as exercises that they would do, just and they used fairy tales and
Yes,
poetry,
yes,
as well as psychology. Hillman was kind of the resident intellectual, but the other two, Bly, the poet, and Michael Mead, the great storyteller, were using fairy tales.
yeah,
They'd have 100 men in a room, and where do you find yourself in the story?
yes,
And there was they would have conflict hour where they would, really voice the things that had gone on during the day. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing, and they would come home, and their wives would say, "Wow, what
yeah,
happened to you? You've
yes,
been transformed by this."
yes.
So it was a beautiful thing, and it went on for 10 years. And in the course of that, um, Malidoma Somé, I think Robert Bly had met him, or Michael, I forget who first, but he came to an amazing gathering they had in Buffalo Gap, West Virginia, where 50 black men and 50 white men came together for a week
Mm,
to go deep. on all kinds of things that they were otherwise afraid to talk about. And Malidoma was from West Africa originally, and he wrote an amazing book called Of Water and the Spirit, which I strongly urge everyone to read. I mean, it was really quite incredible because he describes how when he was a boy in Burkina Faso, he was taken from his village. His father kind of let him go by these Jesuits, and he was raised by the Jesuits till he was 20. And then some experience led him to escape from that world. And he made it back to his village, like several hundred miles away somehow. But then they didn't want to accept him because he'd never been through the standard initiations that all the young people went through. He was now in his early 20s. So he went through the initiation process at that age, which was very tough. And then the message was that his grandfather had been a famous, well-known shaman in that area. And the message came that Malidoma was he who makes friends with the stranger. So he ended up being educated at the Sorbonne in France and in Boston University, and came to tell that story for the first time at this men's gathering before he wrote his book. So anyway, I had heard about him from James Hillman because James said, he kept bringing him up. He said, you really should talk to Malidoma
Mhm.
because they'd had quite a remarkable relationship.
And I wanted to mention too, you described that moment at that gathering. And it was beautiful having known Malidoma in his book, which I agree. In fact, it would be a great prelude to anybody reading your book is Of Water and Spirit to me is up there with Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I mean,
Yes.
it's just an extraordinary, I cried through it. I had just such a deep knowing of the extraordinary journey and what a journey it was, but that even what it did to Malidoma to tell his story for the first time in the West in that group is so moving, and how there wasn't a dry eye in that
Yeah.
entire uh, room with black and white men in together. And thank you, because I didn't know, I had never heard the depth of that particular story. And thank you for sharing that. Again, it's in, I think, the volume 2 of the Hillman biography.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I ended up my wife Alice suggested after I'd seen one shaman because I heard about shaman. I read The Horse Boy, and I'd been to this event where shamanism was came up among other things, and so I ended up we were in the car and Alice said, why don't you reach out to Malidoma? So I had never met him at that point, and but we talked on the phone because I'd interviewed him about James Hillman. So turned out he was doing a divinations in Ojai, California, and I was going back out to California. So I met him for the first time, and it was the beginning of an incredible relationship that I had with this man. And he assigned me right from the front. What a divination is, I'll explain briefly. He'll sit across from you in his, traditional robes, and there's a table in front with there's a bunch of stones and all kinds of objects. There's stones, there's coins, there's many different things that you then take and move, and if you're male, in a clockwise direction, I believe, until he tells you to stop. So you move them with your hand around this circular mandala like table, and then he reads the pattern. And what he told me in the beginning was that he said, your ancestors don't know who your son is, and they need to give him a place at the table. And he assigned me a series of rituals at the beach. I'd go to the beach in Malibu, and I would take uh, rum and Indian corn and apple cider vinegar, and I would go through this ritual on the beach, sprinkling these things in the water or in that area, and communing with my ancestors. Now, this was something I had never done. It was foreign to me. I mean, I just never paid much attention to my immediate family in that way, but it opened something up for me, big time. And then eventually, long story short, but I took Franklin to meet Malidoma in Jamaica, and they got along famously. Malidoma said it's like meeting a colleague,
Mm.
and and they had quite did divinations with him and with myself, and that was the beginning of a relationship between Malidoma and Franklin, which eventually, we can talk about this too, ended up. Um, I took Franklin to Africa twice. The first time before I met Malidoma, sort of on the traditional thing where you go out into the
So,
among the animals.
safari, right? Yeah.
Yeah, on safari. And the second time was with Malidoma and a group of people on a month-long healing journey where Franklin's mom, Etta, and myself accompanied him, and that was life-changing.
Yeah. Which is in the 2017 revised edition for anybody out there, making sure if you want to hear that full story that I just finished and so moving. And I have to say, kind of sad when that part where he takes you back to his village or where all of that happened, and how, what's changed, and how, some of the missionaries and other things that have changed the area, and how I just it was real emotional for me, that part of how what has changed. um so, and I think one thing I'd like to really touch on, I feel like what's so powerful, and I've had the extraordinary opportunity to work with a few dozen folks over my 33 years of working as a Jungian oriented psychologist over the years, who have had uh, extreme states of consciousness like soulchosis, psychosis, and with my own background, because I also guided Vision Quest, did a Vision Quest, worked with a native elder, and then also trained with the Animas Valley Institute, Bill Plotkin, and his work, which is very connected to the mythopoetic understanding and the Jungian understanding. And so much of that also revolved around in guided Vision Quest, actually, for almost 10 years. Initiatory, the understanding of these experiences as initiatory, and in both that, in some other cultures, and I believe Malidoma actually shared this with me, that they would call it bumping into the other world.
Yeah,
And then it was a matter of, oh, okay, it was actually a cause for some degree of celebration of, oh, hey, we maybe have a new shaman, but they then would also be trained with other shamans who understood how to develop that. So I'm wondering how, in terms of your own, and I think this is a big part of James's work too, is seeing, understanding. There's even where, Michael Mead and James would talk about, even traumas, if you understand it from an initiatory standpoint or understanding that you're moving into another larger frame of reference for your life journey. And I know both you beautifully expressed both when you began to see Franklin's experience initiatorially, but also your own initiations, in terms of going to a deeper level with him. And I want to say, I mean, I to that point, that first journey on safari, I think in the book you call it, that chapter is breakthrough, or breakdown or breakthrough, where when you have that long night where his just monologue comes out, and you're trying to reach him in ways you've tried previously, and you get to a point, and I was so moved I cried, that, when you literally cry, you didn't even realize you were crying. And when all of a sudden he says, Dick,
yeah.
are you having a breakdown? Maybe
It
you need to go
was.
to the hospital, which
It
to
was.
me was initiatory for you.
It was. It absolutely was. I mean, that was one of the scariest nights of my life because we were toward the end of our journey, and we'd had a very interesting time with uh, a doctor that had grown up in Tanzania, who would go back periodically, and he was our family physician, and we went with him on this wonderful safari. And toward the end, we were at the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, and I remember the room we stayed in was called Chatu, which I believe was references to serpent. Um,
Mm.
and that night we were just in the room together, and all of a sudden, Franklin just looked at me and said, I don't like you. I don't
Yeah,
like anything about you."
yeah,
And then he went into this incredible, I call it I don't know. I mean, it was rant is not really the word because he was channeling forces,
yeah,
and the things he was saying went back 16,000 years, and taken all together, maybe you might say they didn't make any sense, and yet somehow they made perfect sense and were actually terrifying to me because I didn't know if I could bring him out of this or how if he could come out of it. And I remember well, this will sound cold, and it is actually, but I began writing down what he was saying. I'm sitting across from him because I felt like I had to remember this. I had to record it somehow. I didn't have a tape machine. I didn't go that far, but I just started making notes on these things as he talked, and of course he noticed that and kind of called me on it. At one point, I remember there was a bird. I guess it was a bird. There was this cry outside the window, but it was like a banshee or something. I mean,
Mm,
we were in Africa. We were among forces that my son, as a biracial person as well, was tuning into. They were coming into him, picking up on, and I didn't know what to do. I went up finally to get something to eat, and I was very, very shaken up. And we had a guide there who was taking us around on our safari, and he and Franklin got along very well. He never judged Franklin at all. They just carried on, no matter what Franklin said. There was a regular conversation, and I thought, well, maybe I should bring him down, and he could, help me through this. And then I thought, nope, whatever I got to do it myself.
mm,
And I went back to the room, and Franklin started in again, and I had tried earlier. I just tried a tactic which had worked years ago. I mean, this was earlier in the night. I'd gotten up and started speaking in tongues, ran over to him and just started going crazy myself. And he just looked at me, and like, what are you doing, Dad? If I was Dad, whoever I was in that moment to him. Anyway, what happened was that I finally, I just got up and he was lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling and talking whatever he was saying, and I just I couldn't write anything down anymore, and I just went over and I just said, Franklin, I can't understand the language. I don't know what to do. I can't understand what you're saying, and all of a sudden, and he looks at me and he says, "You're crying."
mm,
I said, "I am." I didn't even realize it.
mm,
And he said, "Are you having a breakdown?"
mm.
Suddenly we were reversed roles,
Yeah.
and he was coaching me how to get through this.
Yeah.
And it was an incredible moment in my life. I mean, because that person that he had been a minute before, was perfectly regular and very sympathetic to how I was feeling. And it again, it just changed the world. It was truly like going through an initiatory process that I had to let go of my writerly persona, the guy who's always, I mean, chronicling everything. I'm sure that, I mean, that's what I do. I have a notebook with me. I'm always writing something down. But it would also, there was a barrier. There's always a barrier there between, because I could remove myself from a situation that way.
Sure.
Writers know this very well, right?
Yes.
And now I couldn't. And I was vulnerable in his eyes.
Mm,
And that's what I had to do.
yeah.
That was what I had to learn in order to, break through this with him. And then he could break through it himself. It wasn't me doing it
Yes.
for him. I was with him.
Yes. Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for the courage of going into that space with him and allowing yourself to break down, break through. I've found that so often to be true. And I remember Malidoma, I remember, because and even some of the work that I did with him, that, so often, they have talismans and different things you would create and, protection and all that. But I remember, I don't know what brought up the conversation, but asking like, what's the most powerful protection? And he said, and I've heard this from some other, well, not only indigenous teachers, but you find it within mystics of most of the major religions too. But uh, here, Malidoma, from this indigenous, the Dagara tribe, said, there's no more powerful protection than a pure heart.
Mm, Beautiful.
And that just really hit me, that yeah, we can do all this stuff and that's great, but there is nothing more powerful. And I've been in that place with myself, with my daughter, with loved ones, even with my grandmother before she passed. And I think the more that being with them, and I know Hillman even would emphasize that the deep meaning behind suffering, and and Michael Mead even talks about that, when we can use suffering as a vehicle for transformation and awakening, and that we are not um, pathologizing. I mean, there was a time when these states would have been demonized and burned at the stake. Now they're, I suppose being pathologized is better than being demonized, but it's still um, that same kind of intellectual distancing. I don't know if it was that time or another time when you said it probably was also a trigger of, these doctors he's had all these years writing on its,
Exactly.
right. And I found so often for me, the power was simply to be with um, whatever it is they're going through it with as much of a heart space and a sense of
Yeah.
vulnerability. And I can't remember who it was that I read who, he was one of the, of course, there was Artie Lang and all the others who you were really trying to begin to look at these experiences differently. But that perhaps the person in madness is not so much, we're not there to look after them as they are there to challenge us and our particular worldview. And certainly we can say, what's truly mad. I think even, Eric Fromm, when he says in the Insane Society, he says the worst kind of insanity is to be sane in an insane society. But
Mm.
in considering our society is insane in the way we relate with nature and each other, that actually to be insane in an insane society is the beginning of a different form of sanity. And I think that's, and Michael Polemony makes, which you turned me on to so many books through your books, who wrote The Shamans Among Us, Schizophrenia, Shamanism and the Evolutionary Origin of Religion, says, those where there is shamanism, psychosis is, or madness is spiritual. And in those cultures where shamanism doesn't exist, schizophrenia is what the label gets. And that he even points out the similar percentages in indigenous cultures and our culture. But I guess all that to say, what for you would you say, looking back now, and I'm really, because we just, when we got on, I really haven't had a chance for you to share kind of where Franklin is now, and having this larger, because it was 2017, so what is that, another 7 years since that, the revised version, kind of where things are. What are some of your deeper insights around this relationship between shamanism and schizophrenia, and kind of, words of wisdom for parents, siblings, others, friends, those out there, or even therapists and others, what you've learned from this journey and where things are on this continuing unfolding journey with Franklin.
Yeah, well, big question. I think the thing that I have really learned to appreciate is the otherworldly nature and the importance of that in my son. That's
Mm,
what might be labeled a disease is actually, he is tuning into other dimensions, communicating with other beings sometimes, that he drawing hieroglyphic, beautiful art. He's a really fine artist. I mean, both sculpturally, where he uses metal and wood, different objects, and outside of in a shop outside the house, and it's filled with these incredible things that he's just, he makes one after the other, and his paintings are amazing too, and often depict, ancient symbols.
mm,
Um, so, I mean, that's really opened a world to me. And of course, it's also, I have a wonderful relationship with Etta, who's his mother. And for years, we were having a very hard time. We were often at odds over what to do in this, what we considered a terrible situation that Franklin was in. But we've been through so much together, and she saw Malidoma as well, and went through some amazing transformative experiences, connecting with her ancestral past as well. And then the three of us went together to West Africa, and that takes up a number of chapters in the book. And I'm not going to try to summarize it, but we were there for like, a month with maybe 20 other people who all had different kinds of things, issues that they were seeking some assistance with. And Malidoma had a healer there, his shaman, I guess you might say, who was a very old man in this tiny little village um, outside of Bobo and in Burkina Faso. And so we were all there in that village we had these big medicine pots, clay pots that were filled with herbs prescribed by this medicine man that we would bathe with and drink from. And each of us had our own pot. And eventually we ended up in a ritualistic series of rituals with goats and with the sacrifice of a bull for us. Um, which we partook of, and along with other people of their own who had their own animals. I mean, that may sound really crazy to people, but it was an amazing experience to go through and brought us much closer together. I think out of that particular time in Burkina Faso, which was in 2016, um, Franklin began to slowly go off his medication. And indeed, over the course of the next year, went off all of it for a period of time. We had been through this together. I think that was a big key, that this was a family thing that had united us in a way that was just a place we'd never been to before with each other. And eventually, in summer of 2017, Franklin's doctor in the Boston area where he was living at the time um, said, okay, let's just go off all your medication. We're almost to the bottom of it. And that's when he had a big crash. And it was a very tough time again, where in the course of which this is post book, so people won't read about it, but we went to Florida where Malidoma was living at the time and went through more ritual with him there. And Franklin, again, he had to be hospitalized for a short time. But it also enabled him to, when he came out of that period, he moved in with his mom in Baltimore. And they have a wonderful relationship there, and I visit them on a regular basis, even though I live on the West Coast. And and I ended up taking Franklin, uh, and but with myself and with a young man from South Central Los Angeles that I've been mentoring, who's a genius in mythology named
Mm.
Romeo. We just finished a book together, actually. But I took he and Franklin, who'd gotten to know each other, to Egypt this past spring, because Egypt was very big
Yes.
in our and Franklin often referred to being in Egypt. I had a very life-changing experience in Egypt at the pyramids when I was young. Um, so without going into all of that, we don't have time, but I took the two of them, and it was an amazing experience. And Franklin was right there for all of it. I mean, we
Mm.
had guides in Luxor and in Cairo, and sometimes he'd, hang back for a little while, but then he'd run up and, listen to everything and just absorb it all in his remarkable way. So he's doing great. I think he's doing better than he has. He's still on some medication, not as much, um, but he's doing better, I think, than he has since he's now in his mid 40s, but since he had that
Mm.
breakdown at 17.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that, Dick. And yeah, two things. One is I found, and particularly, and you mentioned this with Malidoma a few times, and Malidoma has such a great language around some of this, around that, you know, part of what those we might call, in that my new book, the Way of Twilight, I kind of talk about those of us who might walk between the worlds or have a little bit more permutation in our consciousness to other realms more naturally, which is happening every night when we sleep, when we're going into that
Yeah.
hypnagogic state, falling into sleep. In fact, it's fascinating, even where, because as also I was trained as a child psychologist, children before the age of 6 are actually in that theta wave during the day, which is,
Mhm.
uh, that default mode network that we all get as adults that start to dampen down the information we receive during the day is still very open. And that it's also that theta state is when we're dreaming. And also, if you're on a psychedelic or having a psychotic episode, it's very similar. I will often say that the person is in soulchosis or psychosis is an awaking dream. It's like they're dreaming but awake in that way. And again, that doesn't mean, it's not making any ontological saying whether these realms are real or not real, but that they are. As a phenomenologist, we say whatever is appearing to consciousness has is some form of reality, or as Hillman might say, the imaginal, the imaginal realm.
Yeah.
And that, even that, I always love, kind of when he would talk about probably the most defining faculty of the human soul is the imagination or the imaginal. And that these states, particularly those who are particularly in touch with them, are deeply in that imaginal realm. And I found it was so interesting because the extraordinary, and I don't know how you caught so many of the things that he said, but it was really delightful because the depth at which, and so many things that are also he's sharing and talking about, that to me, I've always said I've never met a delusional hallucination that wasn't chock full of meaning. There's usually tremendous meaning, that you'd also be tracking synchronicities in your life, either in your dream life or in other things, that it was uncanny. And you do a beautiful job. I think that's a wonderful part of the book, is that here you're doing tremendous amount of integrating these, showing that there is this meaning there unfolding, if you're really paying attention. Um, but I guess, which evolves into this question, two things that people will say, don't enter in their delusion. And the other thing I'd often have, those in those states, well, don't expose them to more spirituality, don't expose them to more kind of these things, which Malidoma actually would say the opposite. The more that
Yes.
they're having an opportunity to be creative, the more they get to chance to be in these multidimensional, energetic, spiritual spaces, the better they tend to get. And which is completely reverse of what we find in the mental health profession. And and Polemony talks about, even in Shamans Among Us, the Arts Beat program in Winnipeg, which is run by a gentleman who has schizophrenia, and allows people to come in who struggle with these states, and how therapeutic it is for them to come in, have community with
Yes.
other like-minded folks, and really be immersed in this creative process. So I was just wondering if you, any of that hits you or you could speak into.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, it's very mysterious. I mean, Franklin, he'd come up with things just out of the blue that were just so imaginative and
Dolphin sweat for the beer, was that one?
yeah,
So, yeah. molten
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 dolphin
sweat.
sweat.
Yeah, I
And
love
yeah,
that.
I mean, a lot of, I mean, he was an amazing writer in the English language when he was younger, and now as he's gotten older, he's actually does more symbolic language.
Right,
So, in his creations, but that's that's certainly no less real,
right.
and so I also think that the other thing that opens, well, let me just, it's a slightly different segue, but um, it has to do with the ancestors because both Jung and Hillman spoke a lot about the importance of the
Yes,
ancestors, of our forebears.
yes.
And like Hillman used to say to patients, he said, "What would it be like to have dinner with with your great grandparents? What would you talk about? How would that work?" And he had very interesting background himself. Um, but I had never paid too much attention to that, as I say, until Malidoma had me do these rituals, and then I began talking to my ancestors.
Mm,
And finding the vitality of that and what it awakened. And in my case, there was something karmic that I had to deal with, which again, I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but Malidoma assigned me. Um, this was around before we went to West Africa, actually. We did a divination together, and he was, I wouldn't say, I don't know if he was disturbed by it, but he saw things were out of place. And he gave me this very weird to me at the moment assignment that I didn't think I could fulfill, which was he said, you know, you've got to somehow find a slave shackle, and you've got to take it to the middle passage where your Franklin's mother's ancestors crossed, and you've got to return it to the sea because and it will serve as as a unifying. There's going to be something cleared up in that uh, for uh, for Franklin. And I thought, how the hell am I going to do that?
Mm.
I found a slave shackle on eBay
Mm.
and I bought it for $300
Mm.
and I kept it on my desk for a while. I couldn't open it. Now, I'm not going to tell the whole story at this moment, but it was a major thing that I had to do, and I did it. Um, and had to, in the course of that, uh, sort of go into the world Franklin lives in a lot, you know, a lot of the time. I mean, my watch actually stopped and wouldn't start again. Um, I was, thrown into a whole otherworldly state almost without any psychedelics or any other substance. Um, and I did return that shackle to the sea, and I could feel something break open. Eventually, the last time I saw Malidoma, which was at an ancestralization ritual workshop that he was doing, and I was going to do a book with him
Mm.
um, about this series of workshops. So this was the second one I attended, and at this one, I had to actually confront in my own past, ancestral past, a slaveholder.
Mm.
So I did that, and was tremendously emotional for me. And Uh, but again, it's part of an initiatory process, I think, that I've had to go through myself. Um, perhaps in certain ways accounting for my being so drawn to Africa. I've been there several times, having a biracial son, being drawn to this kid from South Central LA who's a genius in mythology and writing a book with him, which is coming out next spring. It's called Bridges, by the way.
Mm. I love the name.
Bridges, a South Central Odyssey. And
Wow.
it's an alternating, we alternate voices through the whole book. And I think people will find it pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can't wait to read it. Maybe we'll have to have you back on. And thank you. I'm so glad you brought that story up because that was clearly one of the most profound moments, similar to the breakthrough experience in Africa. It really moved me on many different levels, and it it was so poignant. And I want to really commend you for the courage and power and willingness to go into those areas, which to me is in such contradistinction to the world right now that's tending to try to erase so many of these critical issues.
Yeah,
And it's actually
yeah.
made me, because my wife is a quarter Native American. My daughter, I think, is also, and my grandmother, clearly there was Native American ancestry. There's a whole story. Maybe when we get a chance, just you and I talk, it's a fascinating story that I would love to share with you. It's in the new book, A Way of Twilight, about this Native American pipe that was somehow in my family, but that in a analogous way, these and I've done work with it's this intergenerational healing family constellation work,
Oh, yeah.
which you go back 3 generations, and which also was kind of developed by the Zulu, the German. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Who had was working in Africa, and this reconciliation work, and how often when there is these breaks or traumas in our in our generational history, intergenerational trauma, particularly a highly sensitive child will take that on, and it ends up
Mhm.
manifesting, particularly ancestors that may not be at rest or other kinds of issues. But I love what you guys you're doing in this new book, Bridges. Um, so and actually, kind of opening this a little bit wider is where, there's so many different areas to go. I mean, there's part of me that wants to talk about Mad in America, the group Mad America, and in that whole work, and even, kind of because it's interesting to me. And I guess what I'll do is I'll just make a footnote here because it could take us far afield. Um, but just like you found what was going on with Cyprexa, and, that the other issue is, and I'm assuming you've read about the D3 receptors, that basically what happens with a lot of these antipsychotics are suppressing the D3
Yeah.
receptors. So the brain creates more of them.
Yeah.
And so when you do come off, you're more likely to have it. And then all of a sudden the profession can say, oh, you definitely have, you'll have to be on this the rest of your life. That once again is kind of a, iatrogenic illness, kind of can be, and I know that can take us far afield, but I guess I just wanted to say, as you've been researching with things like Zyprexa, is that something you've explored or been curious about, or how these medications over time can make relapses more likely, since so much of the FDA research is on very short-term trials?
I haven't explored that per se. Let me just backtrack for 1 second to
Yes,
mention,
please.
because you mentioned family constellation
Oh,
therapy.
please. Yeah, sorry.
There's a wonderful book by a man named Eugenio Ordonez. He's in Mexico, and he did a comparative study of Hillman, Malidoma, and family constellation
Oh, you're
therapy.
kidding. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
and it's terrific. It's a very, very, very interesting book. Anyway, but yeah, I haven't studied that per se. But in recent years, I don't know, and perhaps in a sense it was a preparation for it. I've well, I'm a very close friend of Robert Kennedy Jr., and I wrote his biography well in the last couple of years called The Real RFK Jr. And so in the course of that, I've gotten to know a lot about the pharmaceutical world because he's devoted so much time and energy to the public health crisis that we're in this country, and that includes, certainly mental health that's declining and affecting more and more people and more kids, teenagers especially. The suicide rate has gone way up. We have more than 50% of the country now has chronic disease. So, Kennedy, as controversial a figure as he is, I think if he's becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, is going to, really continue to raise consciousness about what we're eating, all these kinds of things. Anyway, in the course of that friendship with him, I've learned more, and I already had kind of a grounding in it from having gone through years of and then getting to know Robert Whitaker a little bit, who wrote
Robert,
Mad in
yes.
America.
Yes. I love
Uh,
Robert's work. Yes.
yes, it's really quite an expose of
Yes.
how the pharmaceutical industry, takes control and basically puts people on medications forever and makes a lot of money off it.
Yeah.
Whereas there are, other things that have come up through the years, with people like R.D. Lang and others, that have to do also with just with community, as you say, bringing people together to talk about what they're going through and not being on these deadening medications. I'm not putting medication down completely. I
Sure.
think
Sure. Of course not.
it's important and it's
It
it's
has a
good that my,
place.
my son
Yeah.
still is on some medication,
Yes.
and he agrees.
Yeah.
Over years he was on it, back off it again, and but he's right there with it, and but it's not debilitating as it used to be,
Right.
and he's had these other um, worlds that he's been opened to, as well as the ones he communicates with, uh, that have really helped him. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. And are you aware, there's actually a whole new world of metabolic therapy where they're really finding, I don't know if you've seen, but there's some extraordinary anecdotal evidence and some trials underway of everything from the ketogenic diet to, fasting and other ways of,
yeah.
of,
Mm.
of, or not just, arresting, but even sometimes it seems like there's a lot going on in the mitochondria,
Yes.
that can be, um, I'm forgetting who wrote the book, but brain fuel. and that I think the website is Metabolic Mind, but there's quite a few. It's getting a lot of play in a lot of areas, which again is really again these adjunct ways, and and I think the big thing is maybe it's to come down to a land again. Hillman said this to you. And Malidoma said this to you, and you've mentioned it a few times today. And it was when I saw the title for your book before I even knew what it was about, My Mysterious Son, that we're talking about things that are deeply mysterious,
Yeah, we
that
really,
that
really are.
that you cannot reduce to any one of these things. And I think and even with my grandmother, I mean, I even say as even though it was a period of time where insulin shock and ECT, lobotomies, ice baths, I mean, well meaning but very misguided, when they were, importing these the first phenothiazines and Haldol back, literally when she went in, it was about the time, they were getting some of these medications from or drugs from Russia that were being used for torture and anesthesia. And they noticed it kind of, basically made very people compliant. But on the inside, they would describe it as being in a chemical straitjacket and a
Yeah.
horrible experience. And my grandmother actually became catatonic for 7 years, which
Wow.
then became, she had catatonic schizophrenia, which we now know as a result of the medication.
Medications. Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And not to mention being, ending up having, Parkinson's and extrapyramidal syndrome, the
Hmm.
rest of her life. So these things are mysterious, complex. And I think that's what I really love about, and you are an artist as a writer, you paint with words. I mean, and I don't know how you write as much as you write, but it is an extraordinary account of an incredibly loving father. Gets me choked up, um, because the places you two would go, and that you allowed yourself to be humble enough, open enough, curious enough. And to me, it was a journey of a soul journey for both of you, and it's just a beautiful testament to the love between a father and son, and a mother too, as the family. And I get that. I mean, we just have one daughter, and my wife and I, a lot of shifts and changed when we are on the same page, and we're connected around something very beautiful. And about the shackle experience, I really feel my daughter's so connected with her Native American heritage, and that sense of the genocidal kinds of things, or the intergenerational trauma in there. Um, my grandmother, growing up in Pennsylvania, very close to the Carlisle native school there, was
Hmm.
just within about an hour, which some horrible things happen and I'm convinced there's some intergenerational traumas in that family tree. Um, so that was really powerful that Malidoma was tuned into the shackle experience. And boy, could we use this and I guess maybe that's a great place to land. Um, if you see parallels between Franklin's story and the collective changes we're facing as a species, and if we could maybe possibly, what would happen if we could reframe some of these challenges, because as Michael Mead said on our last podcast, we are in a global soul initiation.
Yeah.
So any last words about how this might also be seen on a cultural or collective level?
Well, Michael Mead said this too. I think in the wound is the gift, and we
Yes,
we are
yes.
we are a wounded nation.
Yeah.
We are a divided nation terribly, in a way we haven't been certainly since the Civil War. We've forgotten in a lot of cases that we even can talk to each other, especially if we have, different political spectrum viewpoints.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess what I've seen is I suppose, in my learning to be willing to communicate, to really talk to Franklin and to his mom in ways that I didn't wasn't able to do, or just couldn't go there in the earlier years. That's, I guess, if there's a lesson that's going to be applied culturally, I think we need to listen to each other.
Mm,
And at the bottom is, we're all human. we're all, flawed human beings who have a lot to explore in order to become more of who we are. And then, Hillman's work is all about getting away from, a therapy that's just all about, oh, your mom and your dad, your parents did this to you, and therefore that's why you're the way you are. He was saying, you know, entirely in the last, 20 years of his life, we got to take this out into the culture.
Yes.
That we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse is the name of one of his books with Michael
Yes.
Ventura. So, you've got to take these kinds of things and do something with them toward what we're doing to this planet with nature, and finding what's in your heart to really, it's all about love, and it's about love for each other, and it's about love for the surroundings that we have and the beauty of a whale and a fish, and just the greenery that surrounds us, and start paying attention to those things in ways that maybe we forgot how to do.
No, that's beautiful, Dick. And it reminds me, I mean, Hillman's, real work on the anima mundi, the
Exactly.
soul of the world, and how that, I think that's where that he allowed himself to get into the men's movement. And, it
Yeah.
was a huge, huge change for him, and also contribution to that whole generation.
And it was really not easy for him. And
Oh,
and at first he was dismissed as, because he's so brilliant, right? And he's
right.
dismissed as the egghead philosopher. And he'd have to do some pretty pretty heavy duty things in order.
Yeah.
Well, there was one story of how he won the hearts of these men, where they used to they one night they kind of got off the track, and they were in this room, and they were dancing, and they were dancing with this doll, this
Oh, I remember the story. Yes.
yeah, of a
A
woman,
blow up doll.
a
Yeah.
blow up doll, and they were tossing it around and kind of being, and Hillman got a hold of that doll, and he danced it out of the room,
Mm,
just took it away,
yeah.
and reminded everybody of, hey, we're here for something else. and
Yeah.
and um, so he would do things right from the very beginning. He had no idea what these men's groups were all about, and he had to make big adjustments. And there was another story. There's a guy, um, some guy. They were. It was one of his talks, and so some fellow came in naked and
Oh,
sat down,
yeah.
and just to really mess with Hillman, right? And so what did Hillman do? He looked over and he said, will you stand up, please?" So he'd go with it.
Right. Absolutely. And you made the point, which I hadn't realized, but makes perfect sense, that the Soul's Code, which was his most accessible, popular book,
Yeah,
and was that because he had to learn to talk to the everyday man,
he did. Yep.
and that book probably wouldn't have been what it was, or even may not have been, without his years with the men's
I
movement.
think that's absolutely true. He spoke to me a lot about, and I have couple long chapters
Yeah.
in the biography, volume 2, about it, because it was so important to his development as a
Right.
human being. And then, because he'd always been considered as brilliant as he was with books like Revisioning Psychology and uh, and others, but some people just found him not very accessible. They couldn't just grasp his work. And
Yeah.
those last books he wrote, starting with Soul's Code and then Force of Character, where he writes about what it's like to be getting older, and what do you go through. And he said, he was kind of almost channeling it, because he wasn't that old yet, the things he
Yeah.
was writing about. And then his last book, A Terrible Love of War, which is an amazing book, where he went through some really tough physical stuff as he was writing it. Um, but was with the premise that we have to realize what war has been
Yeah.
throughout human history in order for us to do something about it
Yeah.
and not continue to repeat these mistakes. But we got to embrace it in that sense. And that's really what a lot of his work is about, is embracing, um, in order to reach a deeper part of ourselves, which is the soul, the soul's code.
Yeah. So beautiful. And that reminds me, I'm glad we landed on that, because that's the one book of his I have not read. And
Ah,
you really intrigued me. in the biography that I know I've thought about it. I mean, I have it, it's on my list because it sounds particularly and very timely right now.
I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, the basic premise is goes all the way back to Plato, but it's basically that we choose our parents. The soul chooses where we're going to come in order to have the kind of growth that we need to experience.
Yeah.
And he does all kinds of case history examples of that, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I actually meant The Terrible Love of War.
Oh, well, that one too. Oh, you've read
Yeah,
Soul's
yeah,
Code.
yeah. I read Soul's Code and Force of Character. I haven't read A Terrible Love of War.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And then one that came out after that is called Lament of the Dead, which he did with
Oh,
Sonu Shamsani.
yes, I do have that. And that was to, I did not know Shandasani actually was the person he had helping with the Soul's Code case studies.
Yes,
So
that's right.
that whole connection was fascinating.
And
Yeah, no,
Shamdasani he brought the Red Book, Jung's Red
yeah,
Book, into public awareness. So yeah, these people they're giants. James Hillman, Malidoma died not too long after I saw him
yes, God bless him.
at that time. He was only 65. So these souls are deeply missed,
Yeah.
certainly by me and many others, and so we'll pay tribute to them as we close this.
Yes, amen. God bless them. May they rest in peace and continue to guide us from beyond. Um, and I, yeah, that the Red Book I loved when I think it was in your car and Franklin took a look at it and how much he have loved the book. Yeah,
Loved it.
same,
And
same.
he, yeah, he said another time Franklin's talking about James Hillman. He says, "Oh yeah, he wrote the Human Genome." I said, "Oh, I think it was called the Soul's Code." He says, "Well, that's what I mean."
God bless him. Um, Dick, as far as people getting in touch with your work, or if they wanted to get in touch with you, or just let our listeners know how to find your work.
Well, all my books I think are on Amazon and available. My Mysterious Son is, and the Hillman biography, and my books on the Kennedy assassination. I've been blessed in my life to follow a follow a thread that leads me from one subject of interest to another, and now I've just started a Substack newsletter called Blowing the Whistle, and which is getting a really good response. And
Nice.
there I'm going to cover environmental topics that I've written about in the past, like climate change or what's going on today and what we need to be aware of. Because that environment was my main thrust of my writing for a long time before I started doing different books. So I'm going to be doing a lot on that. And I've recently been writing about the drone situation because I have a book contract also to write about a subject of long time fascination to me, which is UFOs or
Wonderful.
UAPs. Uh,
Wonderful.
so I'm interviewing lots of different people for that, and so that one will come out, I guess, sometime this coming year. And a
Oh,
big year is
fantastic.
coming.
Nice.
2025 is going to be a big year.
Oh yes, it is for sure. And thank you. Can't wait to see these new books. And again, you are extraordinarily prolific. It amazes me. But I'm so
Thank
glad you're continuing to share your gifts and bearing the fruit you came here to bear and following your soul's code.
Trying to still do that at the ripe old age of 77.
Yeah,
So,
that's beautiful. Dick, such a pleasure. And maybe we'll have you back on for one of your new projects in the coming year.
Michael, I really enjoyed our conversation. It's been great talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. You too. And listeners, thank you for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you next time on The Other Side of Things. Thank you for tuning in to The Other Side of Things. I have been your host and guide, Dr. Michael DeMaria. You can find out more about my work at michaeldemaria.com. Explore the books, music, and online programs and films. And we'll see you next time on The Other Side.